Good morning and welcome to Book a Day. Today we're going to take a quick look at two books about C.S. Lewis. We know there are several books on C.S. Lewis coming out this spring in preparation for the release of the movie Prince Caspian in May. The first one is C.S. Lewis, My Godfather. You probably have already seen it. It's a book of all those personal correspondence that he's had with friends, relations, and especially with his godson, Lawrence. Just to give you a quick flavor of the book, he says, "Dear Lawrence, I wonder how you are all getting on. Nothing much has happened to me except I saw a rabbit yawn. I suppose people who keep tame ones have seen it often, but this was a wild rabbit, and I thought it a very curious sight. It was a very bored, triangular yawn in the middle of a long, hot afternoon. I've also been rereading Kipling's Just So stories and have translated all the runes round that picture of the tusk. In case you don't know the runic alphabet, which is a useful secret writing and supposed to have magical results, it is this." And then he actually writes out the runic alphabet. "I am sure you will be able to read the secret parts of this letter, but whether you can read the ordinary bits is another matter. Here's a Christmas box, that is either," and then he goes into the runic alphabet. So it's quite a darling little book, and it would be especially for those who are interested in C.S. Lewis, but not interested in really going into his spirituality or deeply into his thoughts. Another book that's out right now is C.S. Lewis and Human Suffering. And we know that C.S. Lewis wrote the book A Grief Observed after the death of his wife, Joy. But this book takes his look at human suffering in three different stages of his life. The first stage is when he was an atheist, and for him that there is no problem with suffering, because only for one who is going to insist on the existence of God does pain and suffering become a problem. The second moment flows out of his midlife experience, his return to joy. His Christian commitment became so complete that he declared without hesitation that pain was God's megaphone to rouse us out of complacency, or God's chisel to perfect our form. Then his wife Joy entered into his life and all too soon left his life and died. Lewis was shattered, and the journey of his grief is told in the journal, A Grief Observed. And it says here, grief there is aplenty. What we do with that grief, how we cope with the blows dealt us by life, how we come to terms with mortality, our own and others, all this is one of the most important experiences any of us will ever face. An approach to grief that acknowledges what we are going through, that allows us to grieve while protecting us from despair, is critical if we are to steer a steady course through the grief to the rest of our life. But learning to read the signposts that will conduct us safely through the journey of suffering and grief requires a guide. And that's what this book purports to be, to allow C.S. Lewis to be your guide through grief. It may not necessarily be the first book you'd offer a grieving person, but someone who's interested in literature might pick it up, and someone who's interested in looking at grief more, not necessarily because someone they know has died, but more from a philosophical perspective or from a place a little more distant than the acute experience of immediate sorrow and grief, would be interested in this kind of a book, because and even someone who's interested in looking at the problem of evil, or this would be a neat book to offer someone who's in counseling, because it allows them to look at someone who's not overly spiritual, can write fantastically in different areas, and yet can reflect from different parts of their own life, from an atheistic stance, from the stance of someone who has a spiritual life but hasn't experienced sorrow, and from one who's been shattered by sorrow. And that would be a fantastic tool for someone who is in counseling. But I think this will be a neat addition to our grieving section, and I think it will have something to offer that normal grieving books really don't. So, we offer C.S. Lewis as A Grief for Grieving, and we'll be seeing other C.S. Lewis books as the season goes ahead. Thank you, and God bless.